the head of OKW, and his operations chief. 2 enemy fronts closing, 1 order left that might save Berlin. They command Steiner to attack, and the city still surrenders. Stay as we trace the last orders from a cramped map room to the signatures that ended a war. By mid-April 1945, the Reich Chancellery in Berlin had become a fortress of concrete and stale air. The Führer bunker beneath it was the last nerve center of a regime cut off from the surface. Hitler had moved into that bunker permanently on the 16th of January 1945. From there, he tried to run a war that had already slipped from his hands. The Soviet First Belarusian Front had cracked the Silo Heights between 16 and 19 April, and the First Ukrainian Front drove north, pinching the last roads. To the west, US and British forces crossed Germany and linked with the Red Army at Torgau on the Elbe on 25th April. No single chain of command remained intact. Army groups had been shattered, and what was called the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, functioned more as a habit than a headquarters. Inside, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl worked at a long table marked by grease pencils and cigarette burns. They reviewed formations, some down to a few hundred men, like they were still armies. General Helmuth Weidling, newly appointed commander for Berlin's defense on 23 April, reported the only data that mattered. Ammunition was almost gone, fuel nearly dry, and the city's defense sectors were giving way a block at a time. The mechanics of those final days were cruelly simple. Orders went out over lines that were failing faster than they were patched. Couriers replaced telephones. Reality outstripped the paperwork stacked on Keitel's desk. Relief depended on formations that existed mostly on maps. Army Detachment Steiner was a name with too few battalions and almost no fuel. Steiner's infantry were mixed remnants. His panzers were empty silhouettes on Jodl's overlays. OKW demanded counterattacks keyed to arrows and timings familiar from 1940, yet the logic had reversed. Where deep battle once leveraged tempo, now the defenders bled time and space against a foe with fresh artillery and secure resupply. Berlin's local command structure had been built for a siege in zones. Weidling's LVI Panzer Corps linked police units, Volkssturm, and scattered regulars into defensive sectors. The plan relied on interlocking fields of fire, but lacked the machine guns and shells to make them bite. At the strategic level, the only viable outcome lay in surrendering in stages. Hitler forbade that. He still demanded relief from Steiner and imagined formations repositioning across rivers that were already in enemy hands. The Soviets closed their ring on 25th April. Encirclement dissolved the fiction that Berlin could be relieved, but it also simplified Soviet operations. Vasily Chuikov's 8th Guards Army pressed steadily, taking ground with assault groups and direct-fire guns smashing entry holes at street corners. On the western side, Allied policy required Germany's unconditional surrender across all fronts, signed in instruments that left no doubt. SHAEF, under Arthur Tedder and Walter Bedell Smith, prepared texts for a single, comprehensive capitulation. Negotiation, when it came, would be couriered in 2 directions. Jodl carried messages and intent north to the Flensburg government, forming under Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Soviet Stavka insisted the final act be acknowledged in Berlin, at the heart of what they had taken. As communications slipped, procedure took over. Agreements had to include precise ceasefire hours, instructions to cease sabotage, safeguards for prisoners, and duties for German commanders to transmit orders. Every clause aimed to stop one thing: pockets holding out for advantage. Inside the bunker, power fractured under stress. Hermann Göring sent a telegram on 23 April proposing to assume leadership. Hitler stripped him of titles and had him detained. On 28 April, news arrived of Heinrich Himmler's approach to the West, he was dismissed in turn. The leadership that built a police state ruled by loyalty discovered loyalty was a variable. Files that once bound men in fear now recorded their removal. By early 29th April, Hitler turned inward to dictate his testament and to marry Eva Braun. The document named Dönitz as Reich President, with Joseph Goebbels as Reich Chancellor, splitting power for a state that existed only in paper and airwaves. The legal architecture mattered to the men who believed titles could still shape outcomes. It would matter again when signatures were demanded in Yalta English and harsh Russian. At Reims, the Allied setup was clear. The table, the texts, the witnesses, Bedell Smith, Tedder, and Soviet Representative Ivan Susloparov would fix not just an outcome, but a sequence. The ceasefire time would be specified to allow messages to reach scattered units. In Berlin-Karlshorst, the Soviets planned a stage of their own. The building was ready. The final text would be signed before their command and Allied delegates, with Field Marshal Keitel affixing the second definitive signature. The war now turned on clerks, couriers, and signatures as much as tank battalions. That is why those last days looked like a blur of maps, carriers of typed orders, and tired hands holding fountain pens. We are at the door of the bunker conference room, and the war is shrinking to hours. If you're ready to step through it with me, hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment the maps finally go silent. The hour is late on April 20th, and above ground, Hitler makes a final public appearance in the Chancellery Garden, greeting Hitler Youth with pale stiffness. He returns underground to the sound of Soviet guns growing nearer. Maps line the walls. Keitel stands, straight-backed by habit, and points to a thin line marked Steiner. Jodl nods because nodding is still expected. Weidling is summoned. He enters with the facts he has. Assault guns short of rounds, infantry out of grenades, and sectors that now bend rather than hold. He is told there will be relief. The order goes out. Army Detachment Steiner will counterattack from the north. No one in the room can call the fuel trucks that don't exist. The next day, nothing changes on the streets except more rubble and shorter distances on the Soviet artillery charts. Meanwhile, to the west, the Elbe is already a handshake line. American and Soviet troops meet at Torgau with grins and field cameras. April 22nd arrives like a wall. Reports confirm what silence on the northern phone lines already said. Steiner will not attack. The conference room stiffens. Hitler erupts. He pounds the table and says out loud the words none of his circle would utter first. The war is lost. A fantasy dissolves and leaves only a bunker lit by weak bulbs. Orders shift from victory to punishment. He dismisses commanders not present, denounces Göring and Himmler when their maneuvers reach him, and withdraws further into what remains of the underground complex. Göring's telegram is read. Actions follow quickly. Titles stripped, instructions to detain. The consolidation of failure is ruthless but late. Berlin is now a set of battles for bridges and junctions. Zwickau's 8th Guards Army advances building by building, blasting through party walls rather than taking streets head-on. Loudspeakers and leaflets offer surrender. Some squads ignore them, others slip away at night. Phone lines sag. Runners are sent with folded slips. Keitel writes new orders anyway, as if routine can conjure a corps. On 25th April, encirclement tightens. The Soviets complete the ring. Berlin becomes its own world. The Elbe link-up splits Germany physically and psychologically. Dönitz in the north assembles ministers and senior officers at Flensburg within the Mürwik Naval Academy. He calculates for time, asking Jodl for days and arguing that surrender to the West would save soldiers and civilians fleeing the Soviets. Inside the bunker, the sense of proportions flips. For months, Hitler had measured events in armies and months. Now he speaks of hours and personal loyalty. On 28th April, The Himmler news arrives and detonates another circle of trust. Himmler had sought contact with the West. He is dismissed. Another ally becomes an enemy inside a place with no exits. Early on 29th of April, the bunker's routine becomes surreal. A brief marriage ceremony joins Hitler and Eva Braun in a room next to the maps. Then a dictation session, a political testament naming Dönitz Reich president and setting out a last indictment of the enemies outside. Seals are placed on envelopes. Couriers memorize the names they are to contact in Flensburg. The legal handover is fashioned in sentences while Soviet shells thud outside. Weidling fights for hours to arrange a ceasefire for civilians. He sends emissaries under white cloths through shattered lines to reach Soviet posts. He supplies locations, unit counts, and a plea: stop the shelling or permit evacuation. In the afternoon of 30 April, the bunker tightens again. Staff are called into the narrow corridor. Instructions change tone. Hitler says goodbye to some and withdraws with Eva Braun to a smaller room. Shots sound through the concrete. Doors open. People move with rehearsed tasks. Bodies are wrapped, carried up a narrow staircase, drenched with petrol, and burned in a shallow crater of the Chancellery Garden. Inside, Joseph Goebbels speaks like a man whose script has reached its last page. The bunker staff consider flight. The outer world offers only Soviet units and basement fires. That night, breakouts are attempted. Martin Bormann and others try to thread the ruins toward the Spree and beyond. Soviet searchlights sweep gaps. Submachine guns chatter in short, brutal warnings. On 1st May, Dönitz broadcasts from the north and announces Hitler's death. He presents himself as head of state and speaks of continuing the fight where it still makes sense, a phrase that tries to square an impossible circle. Goebbels makes his choice in Berlin. He and his wife do not leave. Their children never see the surface again. The last voice of the regime goes silent in the city he had promised would never fall. Through the night and into May 2nd, Weidling coordinates one last mission: surrender. He moves under guard to meet Vasily Chuikov's staff. Documents appear again where rifles had been. Berlin surrenders on May 2nd. Chuikov's 8th Guards Army accepts the capitulation. The city's guns thin to sporadic cracks and then go still in large arcs. South and east, scattered German units continue firing, but even they can feel the temperature change. Radio traffic now passes surrender clauses as often as fire missions. At Flensburg, Dönitz orders Jodl to seek terms from Schaff. Negotiators travel by air and road to Reims, carrying not hope, but latency. The goal is to stop death at scale, even if in phases. In the early hours of May 7th, inside a modest schoolhouse turned headquarters at Reims, Jodl places his signature on the unconditional surrender. Arthur Tedder and Walter Bedell Smith observe, with Ivan Susloporov signing for the Soviets. The document specifies the ceasefire hour, 23:01 Central European Time on the 8th of May. The delay is not leniency. It is time for orders to reach units spread from Norway to the Balkans. Word races outward. Broadcasts, couriers, and wires compress the last day of fighting into a scheduled silence. Some commanders comply at once. Others try to carve more hours. The Soviets insist on a second, final act in Berlin. Dönitz sends Keitel, Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg, and General Hans-Jürgen Stumpf to Karlshorst. They arrive under an authority that now exists only to end itself. Late on the 8th of May in Berlin, close to the 9th of May in Moscow, Keitel signs again before the Soviet High Command and Allied representatives. He lifts the pen with ceremony learned over decades and finishes the task for which no training prepares a soldier. The war in Europe ends on paper and in radio static. The last maps are folded and set aside. The bunker air is replaced by spring wind through broken windows. Keitel and Jodl were taken into custody within days of the final signing. Donitz's government in Flensburg functioned briefly under Allied oversight and was dissolved on 23 May with mass arrests. The surrender instruments fixed the legal close of fighting and ended the last attempts to split the Allies diplomatically. Millions of soldiers and civilians immediately found a path from uncertainty to survival. Command practices also shifted under occupation. German staffs were disbanded, their communications seized, and authority flowed through Allied control councils rather than any remnant of OKW. Denial is a tactic that burns time. In command, time becomes lives. When a staff finally matched orders to facts, the war ended in days, not months. For more deep dives into decisive hours like these, subscribe so you're here when the next map comes off the wall.